Well, good morning, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well this morning. That last song we were singing, the part that he will never fail, I think that was the last song, wasn't it? That's the one I got focused on. Have you ever sang that knowing it's true but not really feeling it? Oh, I was just looking. I'm just kind of wondering. Well, I don't want you to read into this something that isn't there, but I just thought, there have been times in my life that I know that's true, but I'm not feeling it right now. It's kind of hard, and I'm just kind of putting one foot in front of the other. And while we were singing that, I was thinking about that. That sometimes we just have to proclaim these things, profess these things because they're true, not because we're necessarily feeling them. Amen? And for whatever reason, this memory dropped into my brain. And I was kind of reliving some things, going back through some things. And I feel like that through that memory, that the Father was just kind of, speaking to me, reminding me of some things. And I probably have shared this story with you through the years from time to time, but I feel like I need to repeat it. When Beth and I were in DeLand, Florida, at a church called The Sanctuary, Wanda, you might remember this particular night. There was a gentleman who had been invited to come and speak at our congregation. He was the director, at the time, he was the director of the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. His name was Johan Lukov. He was a South African man. He's the guy who couldn't call me Bill. He called me Bull. You may remember, okay? Well, before that evening service, I was part of the praise and worship team at the time. Back in those days, I had a lot stronger voice than I do now. It was a little bit higher. Of course, my hair wasn't white and I was a lot thinner. There was a lot of things different about those days. But anyhow, we'd gotten there early to kind of go through some music and rehearse and things like that. And I can't even describe the feeling that came over me in advance of that. It just like, I have to get out of here. I have to get out of here. I don't need to be here. I don't want to be here, et cetera, et cetera. And I can't even explain to you to this day why I was feeling that way. I can speculate, but I don't really know. It just all of a sudden just came. I'm like, I don't need to be up here. I don't need to be singing these songs. I'm not the kind of person that should be up here. All these kinds of thoughts going through my head. And when we were there was a back room where the musicians and choir would gather before the service. And we were back in that room at this point in time. It just come on me so heavily, and I got to get out of here. And so I walked out the back, and I head to my car. And I can relive it. When I close my eyes, I can see it all again right now. My hand was on the latch for the door. And not an audible voice, but a voice said, "Stop. Go back in there." And I stood there with my hand on the latch thinking, "Bill, you've really gone off the deep end. Now you're hearing voices." But my hand was on that latch. If anybody was witnessing that, they probably thought I was nuts. But that voice just said, "Stop. You go back in there." I did. And I've thought many, many times, what would the trajectory of my life and consequently that of my family be if I had not listened? If I had just gone ahead with what I was feeling at that moment and acted out of my feelings and my emotions? Don't know for certain, but I think it's possible that if I had not heeded that correction, perhaps I wouldn't be standing before you right now. Now, you can measure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, But nevertheless, I've often wondered about that. It was just in that instant that things could have been so very different in my life, and again, consequently, the life of my family. So, with that thought rolling around your head, the name of this portion, Chukat, it's translated, this is a statute or an ordinance. And as we've shared before, it is understood that Chukot are these ordinances that are so beyond our comprehension to understand fully and completely that we wonder why God put these things here in the first place. Because to our logic, to our reason, to our our finite minds, his infinite wisdom doesn't really make any sense. And so we have a hard time understanding God sometimes. Does anybody else have that issue from time to time? I don't understand you. I know you're God. You can do whatever you want to, when you want to, how you want to. I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense. Well, everybody experiences that. Well, Chukat are these statutes and ordinances that are understood anyway in Jewish belief to kind of embody that idea, that concept. But now, even though these rabbinical sources believe that some of these statutes are beyond our comprehension, they are also very quick to point out that our inability to understand is due to the limitations of the student, not the teacher. Just because we don't understand it, just because it doesn't make sense to us, doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense. And we are all familiar with this scripture, Isaiah 55. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So there are many things in this particular portion, not just this one, but there are a lot in this portion. A lot of things that are, in my view anyway, hard to understand. There are topics that are hard to understand and yet seem to have some connection to other topics in this particular Torah portion. And so then when we come across these things that are difficult to understand, why did you put that there? Why did you put that there right after saying this? And those kind of questions arise in our mind. I believe that's the Creator's way of provoking us to stop and listen to what I'm saying. Got your hand on the latch, so to speak, but stop and listen. Of course, one of the more difficult, one of the more puzzling in all of Scripture is the red heifer rite that's been in the news as of late. So it begins this way in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 19. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, this is the chukat, the ordinance of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel that they bring you a red heifer, para'adamah, without blemish, in which there is no defect, and on which a yoke has never come. So in my mind, the first thing that comes to mind when mentioning go speak to Moses and to Aaron about this, the mentioning of Aaron automatically reminds me of another cow, something that's already happened. Because Aaron played a very significant role in another story that involved a cow, right? Except this one was not red. It was gold, right? Because he's the one who fashioned the golden calf. He's the one who had kind of been left in charge to restrain the people. That's the way Moses put it. Not to let them go crazy, not to let them go wild, not to let them act in an uninhibited fashion. That's why he was there. And yet when they came to him, we need a God of gold. And he said, well, go break off the earrings and I'll do it. But tomorrow we're going to keep a feast of the Lord. And then, of course, when he fashions this, you know what he tells Moses. When Moses comes, and how did this happen? He said, well, I took the gold, threw it in fire, poof, out jumped this golden calf. Well, that's when Moses rolled his eyes, even though that's not recorded. Anyhow, Aaron was very much involved with what amounts to a national sin. And it's something, a memory, a sin, a transgression, and all the consequences connected to it that show up again and again and again and again and again in Israel's history. The golden calf is the epitome of what it means to be unclean, to be corrupted by things that are unclean. So then, the counterpart to the gold cow is the red cow. It teaches that the ashes of the red heifer, in that those ashes, when mixed with water, and those waters of purification, are intended to cleanse those that had been contaminated. And those ashes of a red heifer were to atone for the sin and the corruptive influence of the golden calf. And interestingly enough, and this is one of the paradoxes, that we have. Is that the correct term? Paradoxes? Not paradoxeme or paradoxi, but just paradoxes. Okay, just wanting to make sure. These waters of purification cleanse those who were defiled by contact with the dead. The ashes from the burning of the golden calf, when it was mixed with water and people were made to drink it, that identified who should die. So there's a very interesting counterparts here and connections. The instructions pertaining to the burning of the red heifer contributes, at least in my mind, to the idea that there are many of these commands that are, at least on the surface, beyond our human comprehension. In that, what? Why? How does this accomplish all these things? The burning of the heifer, and then the waters of purification. And the person who burns is made unclean, and yet they're doing something that is to bring about an avenue for others who are unclean to be made clean. So all these kinds of things. So then it purifies the waters of purification, the ashes of the heifer, purifies those contaminated while contaminating those who were pure. That's the kind of thing that keeps me awake at night. Why were those who prepared the ashes made unclean? Why is that? The Hebrew word for heifer, para. So, ladies, be on alert if your husband one day calls you para. It's not a good thing. I know, filter. Okay. Para. I was trying to help the ladies out. Okay? That word, on one hand, it denotes fruitfulness, things that are growing, that are multiplying, because it is related to the word pari, as in puri hagafen, the fruit of the vine. So para, the word for cow, or the word for heifer, if you will, is related to the idea of something that is being very fruitful. A fruit that is growing unrestrained, unrestricted, that's flourishing. The tares are sown in the midst of the wheat being the good, the tare not being good. The tares are sown in the midst of the wheat to restrict the growth and the multiplication of the wheat. And so God wants the wheat to grow unrestrained, unrestricted by the tares and these things of the world. So that's kind of the idea behind this word, actually. All right? However, the word pe resh he, para, is related to the word para pe resh aleph. And that means free of any kind of control, uninhibited, but not in a good way. This is the same word that is used, translated as wild, when it's describing Ishmael. Now that's not so good, right? So these two words they sound the same, and they have similar concepts attached to them. But one is the positive and one is the negative. So then, coming in contact with what is represented by such wild behavior, that is, wild like Ishmael, unrestrained, or like the people when they were breaking out and coming to Aaron to fashion a golden calf and all the things that were subsequent to that event. That's the kind of wild behavior we're talking about. And what does that behavior in 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 do when it comes in close contact with another 5, 10, 15, 20, hundreds, thousands? What does it do? Or what does it have the potential to do? We'll put it that way. If that's corrupt and you come in contact with it, what is the potential for you to be corrupted, right? So that's why it's always a good idea that we pick our friends and associates very carefully, right? So this wild, uninhibited, unrestrained behavior that which was going on at the foot of Mount Sinai, it has the ability, it has the energy to contaminate others. However, when that kind of activity that is in a person or a group of people is placed on the altar, so to speak, In other words, placed on the altar in order to surrender and to die. The ashes of that idea can be used for a holy purpose. Let's put it this way. All of us have stories, right? All of us have a past. And some of those things we don't really want to think about too much because we've died to that and we don't want to go back to that. However, on this side of things, can those things serve a holy purpose? Can those things serve? Because is there not one who can take something that's bad and bring something good out of it? Is there not one who can take something that is unclean and bring something clean out of it? That's what we're talking about here. So that, if you can, hope you're following me here, this idea between the gold cow and the red cow, they're connected somehow. One's on the negative aspect of things, and one is an avenue to bring things that are unclean into a state of being clean. And so then, when Korah's rebellion erupts and it's spreading through the camp, the 250 notable men are told to bring your censers, and we know the story, what happened. Fire goes out from the Lord and consumes them, but what becomes of those 250 censers? They're holy now. They're dedicated as holy. They're placed there at the altar to do what? To remind people, to be a reminder of those things that were past, those things that happened, the consequence of all those things, results of what can happen if we're not going to heed the voice of the Lord, and how our lives can be changed when we do, because there were sons of Korah who removed themselves from that rebellion, and they wrote psalms that we celebrate even to this day. So then purification of sorts occurs when we listen, pay attention to the voice of the Lord. And that connection that we've had with death and rebellion and all those things can be consecrated and turned around for something that is good. Are you with me so far? Okay. Now, verse 9 of chapter 19. These ashes, they shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for the waters of purification. It is for purifying from sin. The cleansing of what was considered unclean was made possible by these waters of purification, and they were waters of purification because they had been mixed with the ashes of this particular burnt red heifer. Specifically, if you read the text, you see that it was to cleanse from the contamination that occurred when you came into contact with death or a corpse. And being unclean in that regard meant that you, while you were unclean anyway, you were excluded from the sanctuary. Verse 13, whoever touches the body of anyone who has died defiles the tabernacle of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel. He shall be unclean because the water of purification was not sprinkled on him. His uncleanness is still on him. And so unless you wanted to be cut off from the community, the waters of purification were pretty important. Unless you just didn't want to have anything to do with anybody in the congregation, you want to be the lone wolf and do your own thing, go your own way. I mean, if that's what you wanted, okay, you can do that. But if that is not what you wanted, if you wanted to be part of what was going on, the waters of purification were critical. Because once, if you don't have them, if you aren't cleansed by them, according to what we're reading in the portion here, without the waters of purification, once defiled, always defiled. That's what it says, in a manner of speaking. You know, we like to talk about once saved, always saved. Well, once defiled, always defiled, unless you get cleansed. All right? In fact, in the context of the red heifer and the waters of purification, this idea connects to the fact that there is no temple standing in Jerusalem right now. Because as it's been in the news, and we've been talking about this for a long time, not necessarily us here, but just the body, about the importance of the ashes of a red heifer, the waters of purification, all these things, as it relates to a sanctuary. Even if someone immersed themselves in a mikveh, they would still be considered unclean in regard to the sanctuary if they had come in contact with a corpse. We also need to consider that the corruption that is associated with death is contagious. Verse 14, this is the law when a man dies in a tent. All who come into the tent, and all who are in the tent shall be unclean 7 days, and every open vessel which has no cover fastened on it is unclean. So then, in the terms of the sanctuary, just as a virus can easily spread from person to person or family and family and has the potential to infect an entire congregation, the corruption that is associated with death is pervasive that way in regard to the sanctuary as God sees it. Because he's making it very clear to us, I think he is anyway, because I'm holy, I'm about life. He's not God of the dead, he's God of the living. Death represents corruption. Death is the consequence of sin. And so when you come in contact with that, you are contaminated by it. And if you're going to approach me, then you have to be cleansed of that, because I'm not going to permit that to come into my presence. I want you to come into my presence. I want you to approach me, but there is a particular way it must be done. So that's what he's laying out here. And so this corruption that is associated with death was pervasive, it was contagious, and so God says there's a remedy for it, but you need to recognize what's going on. And so once again, this idea that you've been corrupted when you've come in contact with this, if you're going to approach me who is holy, there has to be a protocol followed here. So it amplifies the value. That amplifies the value of the waters of purification and the red heifer. Now, maybe you've kept up with this, maybe you have not. But if you've kept up with this whole idea about the red heifer, then you should be aware that red heifers aren't as easy to come by as some might think they are. In fact, 25, 30 years ago, there was a cattle grower in Mississippi. I don't remember the man's name, but he thought he had a red heifer, and it made the cover of Newsweek or Time or something like that. And anyway, everybody was talking about, they're going to rebuild the temple. They found the red heifer, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that was 30 years ago. And the reason we don't have a temple right now is because they found a couple of white hairs in that red heifer. And it was disqualified. Point being, these red heifers aren't as common as we might think they are. In fact, I'm of the view that they are so rare that if one shows up, it's because God caused it. In other words, the Creator essentially provides a red heifer for them because it isn't so common. The point then is this. In terms of what we're talking about in the Torah portion, in regard to the sanctuary, the opportunity to be made clean would have been considered precious. It would not have been regarded flippantly as something to be taken for granted, as something to be considered as commonplace. It was to be considered precious. And in that line of thinking, holy. Because with the red heifer and the ashes and all the things that had to happen, it was apparently very hard to come by unless God provided the means and the way. So then, rash, impulsive behavior could do a lot of damage. Not just used to could. It does now, right? Rash, impulsive behavior could cause a lot of damage, and without the ashes of a heifer, in the context of the sanctuary and the waters of purification, that damage that is done could be very difficult to overcome. So then, again, being cleansed of corruption, being cleansed and being made clean is not something to be taken lightly. We should never take what he has done for us lightly. We should never take it for granted. Let's add to that the importance of responding to the opportunity when he presents it to us. Here's what I mean. Verse 11 and 12. He who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, he will not be clean. So then this prompts a question in my mind. What if the waters of purification are applied on the 2nd day and then on the 5th day? No. Or the fourth day and the sixth day? No. Or the third day and the fifth day? So in other words, there's a reason that I don't pretend to understand, because sometimes God is very hard to understand and to comprehend. But for whatever reason, God said it has to be done on the third day and it has to be done on the seventh day, not the second and the fifth or whatever other combination we could come up. And so that means, even though we can speculate as to why these particular days were chosen for that, the point is there was a specific time that he determined was allotted to be cleansed from your contamination. Let's translate it into our world. God will give us a window of opportunity to respond to him. But if that window closes and we miss our opportunity, it's not on him, it's on us. I go back to my hand on the latch of that door. There was a very brief window in which I had to make a decision to follow through with my raging emotions at that time, or to stop and listen to what that voice was speaking to me. Not loudly, mind you. Strongly, not loudly. I had a very small window of opportunity to make a choice. And again, if I had decided to go with my emotion at that point, would I be standing before you right now? Whether or not we respond to him when he presents that window of opportunity to us can and will have long-term ramifications, good or bad. So there's a passage that comes to mind when considering this, and it's something, again, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, Isaiah 55, verse 6. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him. So not only are the waters of purification and what that concept represents to us, not only are they of infinite value, but it's extremely important that we seize the opportunity to be cleansed when that opportunity is presented to us, not when it is convenient for us. But because by the time we consider that it's a convenient time, it might not be available. Is there a Bible for that? Proverbs chapter 1, verse 24. Because I have called and you refused. I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, I also will laugh at your calamity. That seems kind of harsh. And yet, what does it say? I will laugh at your calamity. When the kings of the earth are plotting and scheming to break the bonds, his bonds away, and to prevent his king from sitting upon his throne, what does the one who resides in heaven do? He laughs. So yeah, there are times when the Creator says, you thought you had it all figured out? Well, I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish comes upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would have none of my counsel and despise my every rebuke. So my point is, it seems that the Scripture is very clear that it's not only important that we respond to the Lord, but it's very important that we respond to the Lord when he is calling to us. That's what we're responding to, in fact. He's calling us. He's summoning us. He's challenging us. And it's very important that we respond to him when he is calling. Let's not wait until he no longer does that. Oh, will he ever stop that? Ask the 5 virgins who had to go out at midnight and find oil if you can get shut out of what he's doing. Ask all the people who heard the preacher of righteousness, Noah, all of those years, ask them when that door was shut. The answer is what? Yeah, there is a time he doesn't call. And so responding to him when he calls is critical, as is doing exactly what he says to do. Doing it his way. So now, I want to compare the result of having the water of purifications, what the result of being sprinkled with the waters of purification is. Compare that to the result of what we see happening at Meribah and the waters that issued forth there. You've got all these people, once again, lamenting that they had not died with their brethren during the rebellion. I mean, you just think about that for a second. We wish we would have died with our brethren when God carried them down into hell alive, or when he consumed them with the fire that came out from before him, or the plague that wiped out so many people. Oh, we should have just died with them. If that's not raging emotion, I don't know what is. And so they're lamenting that they had not died with their brethren in the rebellion. And so they're complaining about the lack of water. And so the lack of water apparently kind of brings all of this to the surface. So they're complaining, so the Lord responds. Chapter 20, verse 7. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, you gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Remember, we're talking about not only is it important to respond when God is calling, but it's important to respond in the way he says to respond, okay? Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock. Now again, the waters of purification have been talked about. Now we're talking about this other water. You shall bring water for them out of the rock and give drink to the congregation and their animals. And so Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels. Moses calls his congregation rebels. John called his audience a brood of vipers. Messiah called some people who were listening to him a bunch of whitewashed sepulchres full of dead men's bone. Okay, just keep that in mind in the future. I've never said anything like that. All right? No. Somebody said yet. I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. Hear now, you rebels. Must we bring water for you out of this rock? And then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. And now all of us know how this turns out. We've read this many times. You've studied it. We've talked about it. You've probably, meditated upon it. But the end result is this. Because Moses didn't do things exactly as God said, Moses is barred from entering the land of Canaan because, God tells him, you did not hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. It's difficult for me, personally, to comprehend the consequence of Moses' actions. I mean, I understand it. God said it. He has his reasons. It's just hard for me to comprehend because, well, the question has arisen in my mind from time to time. Does the punishment meet the crime? Apparently it does. But I'm not the only one to have questioned this or wondered about this. In fact, I've got a couple of quotes here from some rabbinical literature. The Ramban, Nachmanides, said this: the matter, that is the consequence of Moses' sin, the matter is a great secret of the mysteries of the Torah. In other words, just as mysterious as the ashes of a red heifer and then making someone clean who had been unclean. So too, it's just as mysterious as to why Moses was kept from going into the land because of this. Especially when you compare that to what the other people were doing. The bad attitudes, the grumbling. Oh, we wish we just would have died with everybody else. Why? Because there's no water. Many of those people went into the land of Canaan. Kind of interesting. Nobody that Moses called rebels, none among them had to bear the same kind of responsibility that Moses did. But some of them were allowed to go into the land, he was not. And so we could speculate, we could debate, we could deliberate, we could come up with some ideas of why Moses was not permitted to do that. But the bottom line is this. God said he was not going to enter the land, and that was that. And sometimes God is just difficult to comprehend. God said, it's because you did not sanctify me in the sight of the people. Well, that time, true. How many other times had he? Well, apparently, it was this time that really mattered in terms of going into the land. So I guess what I'm trying to get across here, all those great and wonderful things that we thought we have done or we think we have done for the kingdom of heaven, guess what? He still expects us to continue to obey him today. And he will be expecting us to obey him tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. And so we should never be seduced into thinking that I'm just too valuable to the kingdom of heaven. We should not seduce ourselves. We should not be deluded to think that we're just too important, that God can't do this without me. God says, I'll show you. Moses, time is coming for you to sit down. Somebody else is going to take your place. You're not going into the land. Please let me go into the land. No. Please let me go into the land. No. In fact, don't bring this up to me ever again. Moses' mistake and what he did that particular time could not be winked at, could not be overlooked, couldn't, in light of what was entrusted to him, to be a representative to the people, to be a representative of God to the people. He could not let that go. Because what Moses did, not hallowing him in the eyes of the people, is equated to not believing him. In other words, speak to the rock. No, I think I need to hit it. That's basically, I don't believe you, I'm going to do it my way. And by the way, his way was fueled by emotion, frustration, aggravation, all those kinds of things. Okay? Had his hand on the latch, decided to go with his way, and it cost him dearly. To not believe him and to be fueled with his emotion to do what he did, to not hallow God in the eyes of the people, is not too terribly different from the evil report that the spies brought back. Yeah, it's different. I get it. But there are similarities nevertheless. And there are consequences. In fact, Moses suffered the same consequence as the people who believed the evil report. Is that not true? Not going into the land. So I'm not saying that Moses was just as, whatever the word you want to use to describe the masses. I'm not saying that he was, that he functioned that way and operated that way all the time. I am saying he was human. And being in the place that he was in, it was extremely important, very, very important. Hello? Am I hearing things again? No. It was very important that he listened to God's voice and did exactly as he was instructed. Now, where Moses is concerned, some have insisted that this wasn't really fair. That doesn't seem fair to us. Look at what they did. Look at what they did all the time. Look at all the great and wonderful things he did. Look at how many times he stood in the gap for them. It doesn't seem fair. And in our feeble and limited minds, perhaps it isn't fair. But let us be reminded that his thoughts are not ours. His ways are not ours. And so who are we to challenge him on what is fair and what is just? So in that same vein of thought, I want you to consider this. Why didn't God do to Edom what he did to the king of Arad, to Sihon, and Og? Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you understand what I'm asking you? Let's read it. Chapter 20, verse 14. Now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, and I'm going to skip down to verse 17. Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from wells. We will go along the king's highway. We will not turn aside to the right hand or to the left until we have passed through your territory." Then Edom said to him, "You shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with the sword." And so the children of Israel said to him, "We will go by the highway, and if I or my livestock drink any of your water, then I will pay for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more." And then he said, "You shall not pass through." So Edom came out against them with many men and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory, so Israel turned away from him. That's not what happened when Sihon was asked and Og confronted, and when the king of Arad confronted them. It seems to me that Israel could have very easily invaded and destroyed Edom, but instead they turned away from Edom. They took another route. But when they encountered Sihon with the same request and they got the same response, the outcome was very different, wasn't it? They went to war with them, destroyed them, took over their territory. Now, Deuteronomy tells us that God commanded Israel not to engage Edom because Edom was considered to be their kinsman. He's your relative, so I don't want you to go to war with him. However, hasn't Edom, and to this day, isn't Edom regarded as one of the primary antagonists where Israel is concerned? Has always been that way from the very beginning. So I could argue that Edom was, and even to this day, is far more dangerous than Sihon. In Ezekiel chapter 35, Esau or Edom has this ancient and unnatural hatred toward Israel. So again, my point is, what made Edom and his antagonism toward Israel different than Sihon's or Og or the king of Arad, all of which God delivered them over into Israel's hand, but Edom, he said, leave them alone. Now, here's what our logic and reason would say. We should have wiped Edom out too. We should have done the same thing to Edom that we did to Sihon, to Og, and the king of Arad. Why didn't God allow for that? Now, in the end of days, there's prophecy after prophecy where God addresses Edom, and he is going to reckon with Edom because of all of these ancient sins. However, that hasn't yet come to a complete fruition. So why did he decide to wait for them and didn't wait for Sihon and Og and all these others? Because in our mind, well, if we're doing this with them, we should do that with them. Because that would be fair. That would be the right thing to do, wouldn't it? But again, we're reminded his ways are not ours. His thoughts are above ours. So then, let's look at this possibility. The refusal by Edom to allow them to enter their land forced Israel to go another way and to come into the country of the Amorites. And by coming into the country of the Amorites, now they've got another thing to deal with. But it also forced them to confront another issue, having to go around, take the long way home, so to speak. They had to go around, and this provokes them to confront yet another issue, and that issue is their stubborn unbelief. Chapter 21, verse 4. Then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, because Edom said no. And the soul of the people became very discouraged on the way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and our soul loathes, abhors. That word means to be sickened by. Our soul loathes this worthless, contemptible bread. Now, what bread are they referring to? The manna that God serves them 6 days out of 7, the double portion on the 6th day. Our soul loathes the bread that you give to us. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. So let's put ourselves in their shoes for just a moment. Well, if I had been there, I would have set them straight. I would have told them they're just thinking the wrong way. They're doing the wrong thing. Of course you would have, because you're special, right? Here's their mindset. They've been refused passage. They're tired. They've been in the wilderness. Can't blame them for being tired. That's just what's going to happen. And they're thinking maybe we'll take a more direct path to our destination. But no, Edom's standing in the way. And so they've been refused passage, and they're forced to take the long way around. And so they get thinking about this, and where's the water, where's the food, even though they're being given food, right? It's just not what they wanted. It's not what they wanted. It's what they needed. It's not what they wanted. And so their present situation apparently overshadows the miracles that they've seen in the past. It overshadows the lessons they've learned from all the other stupid that they've done since they left Egypt, right? Their present circumstances have kind of erased all those things from their mind, it seems anyway, because I wish we'd have just died. Why did you bring us out of Egypt in the first place, out here to just die? There's no food, there's no water. So all of those miracles and lessons of the past aren't what's on their mind. They're still convinced that God's not going to provide for them, to the point that they're speaking disparagingly of the manna that falls out of heaven 6 days out of 7, that which God chose to give them to eat. Perhaps in part to break them from the appetites that they had in Egypt, not just the physical ones, mind you. So to disdain, to abhor, to loathe this contemptible bread, as they put it, is akin to disdaining the gift that God has given us through the Messiah. And I say that because the Messiah identified himself with the bread that your forefathers ate in the wilderness. He connected himself to that. And so again, what they're loathing, what they have contempt for, is the gift that God gave them, gives us, through the Messiah, which that then provokes me to remember what Paul counseled you and me not to do. And this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning verse 1. I'm going to read a good bit of this. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Messiah. But with most of them, actually all but 2, but with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And so all the people who saw the miracles in Egypt, all the people who heard the screams outside their doors when the destroyer went through the land, and yet God preserved them because he had passed over them. The blood of the Lamb was on the door. All those people who had witnessed that, all of those who had seen the pillar of cloud set between them and Egypt to keep Pharaoh and his chariots at bay, while God opened up a sea before them so that they could walk through on dry land, and on their right and on their left, the waters have congealed in their midst. So they're solid, they're formed so that they could walk through. Having seen that, and then Pharaoh pursues them into the sea, and the waters close and destroys Pharaoh and his chariots, and the weapons wash ashore, and they got their tambourines and they're singing, they're dancing, and then 3 days later, what were they doing? You remember? Complaining. But he gave them water miraculously. They've seen all these things. And yet, here we are once again. All the people who saw that, Paul reminds us, but most of those people didn't make it into the land because they could not bring themselves to believe that the God who had started all this could finish it. They could not they could not convince themselves that the God who delivered them from Egypt was able to close the deal and bring them into the land. That's the bottom line. And so their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Paul goes on, now these things became our examples to the intent, for the purpose that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And evil doesn't necessarily mean, or doesn't exclusively mean, let me put it that way, things that are obviously and blatantly evil. Evil sometimes shows up as an angel of light. Evil sometimes, very commonly, shows up as things that appear to be pleasant to the eye, good for food, and desirable to make one wise. So let's keep that in mind. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. The gold cow. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. That's the sin of the Baal Peor. But here's what we're going to emphasize. Nor let us tempt Messiah, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. And so how did they tempt Messiah? That which God was giving them, that they needed, their daily bread, the bread that comes from heaven. It wasn't what they wanted, didn't appeal to them. There were things back there they'd much rather have. And so they tempted him. They complained about it. They abhorred this worthless, contemptible bread. And as a result, they were destroyed by serpents. Paul goes on and says this. Now, if you've thought up until this point, I've never done any of those things, nor would I ever do any of those things. Stay tuned. Nor complain. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, and this is the point, all these things happened to them as examples. And they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. And if you are like me, I believe that's the time we're living in. How many of you believe we're living in the end of the age? So these things are written for us as an example to us, an example of what not to do. I've said this many times. I'll say it again. Most of our life in ministry has been learning what not to do. And that's not a bad thing, actually. Learning what not to do. Because if I know what not to do, it kind of helps me focus a little better on maybe what I should be doing. So these things were given to us, written for us, for our admonition. Therefore, and I'm going to rephrase this just a little bit. Let him who thinks that he can't be replaced not kid himself. Let him who thinks that he's just too valuable to the kingdom of heaven to be replaced, that God would never do that. That's not how it words or it's worded, but that's what he's saying. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So now, come to this thought. I wonder how many of those who died because they were bitten by the fiery serpents had said, we should have died with our brethren. Let me pose the question again, or the observation. I wonder how many of those people who died by the bite of the fiery serpents died as a result of that, had said, I wish we had just died with our brethren. What's the point? Be careful what we ask for. And I'm speaking to me too. We need to be careful what we ask for because we just might get it. This prompts me to, once again, remind us all. Sometimes it's just best if we keep our mouths shut. I actually caught myself the other day wanting to say something, and I went, we need to be careful about what we ask for. We need to be careful about what we say. What we say might come back to bite us. I've had that happen to me before. I'll admit it. Has that happened to you before? Okay, of course it has, because we're all, at times, stupid. We do stupid things. But the reason, let me see how I want to say this. All those stupid things don't have to be the end of the story. It can be, since we've been redeemed, since we've been born again, it can be those constant reminders of, that was not the thing to do, and that helps us better discern what we do need to do. And sometimes we need to just shut up. And especially when our emotions are raging. I'm the kind of person that when I get mad, I get really quiet. If you've ever wondered if I get really mad, you'll know if you see me get real quiet. Now, yeah, I can argue and carry on, but I'm not really that mad. It's when I don't say anything. Some people aren't like that. I am. But my point is, for me anyway, because when I'm that mad, there's no telling what could come rolling off my tongue and go spilling out of my mouth. And I know, and I've learned through experience, that when those things happen, as soon as they leave my mouth, I'm already going, I should not have said that. I'm going to pay for this. It's going to come back to bite me. And it usually does. So we need to be careful about what we say, especially when our emotions are raging, because it probably will come back to bite us. That's what happened to these people. The wording to describe these serpents, it's the fiery ones. And so apparently, this is according to some commentary anyway, they're these fiery serpents because the venom made the victims feel as if they were burning up. We need to be careful that we don't allow what we perceive to be our strength to be our undoing. We all have strengths, but what I have found is that a lot of times what we consider to be our greatest strength is also potentially our greatest weakness. David was a very passionate man. He would pluck the strings on that harp and he would pour out his soul and his heart to God. But it was that same kind of passion that pushed him to do other things as well. So we need to be careful that we don't allow what we think to be our greatest strength to also be the potential cause of our undoing, especially when our emotions are running high, or let's put it this way, burning within us. Because you see, when we do things like that and we act rashly because these passions and emotions are burning within us and we act out of emotion alone, that might burn us in the end. That's what happened to these people. So then, in short, when things are beyond our comprehension and situations refuse to conform to our logic and our way of doing things, it's important for us to remember that our emotions will possibly lead us down the wrong path. Because his ways are not our ways, are they? His thoughts are not ours. And so to give into our line of reasoning in certain scenarios can be very hazardous to your health. And not only that, but even when God provides an answer to a particular situation, even when he responds, that answer might provoke just as many questions. Has that ever happened to you before? God responds and we're like, huh? That's your response? That's your answer? I don't get it. I don't understand, because that's not what I had in mind. That's not what I thought was going to happen. That's not the way I thought it would happen, should happen, when I thought, all these kinds of, has that ever happened to anybody else? And then the response is just as mystifying. I'll go back to my hand on the latch story. I didn't plan to talk about this at all. It just kind of happened that way. So I go back inside. We have a service. Beth and I had a conversation at one point there. You remember that? And I got called to the platform at the end of the service. And we're singing, Give Thanks with a Grateful Heart. All right? And so as we're singing this, I'm looking across the stage. Johan was sitting over there where the men sat over there. I'm talking to Wanda. And this guy's standing there, and he's just staring at me. He was a pretty big fella, and he was just staring at me. I'm like, what is that guy staring at me for? You know. Anyway. And that voice again said, no, don't go anywhere. At the end of the service, he's going to come and speak to you. I'm like, I'm hearing voices again. But just in case, I hung around. He bolted off the stage, down the aisle, headed to the front door. And I thought, yeah, I'm crazy. I knew that. So I'm about to come off the stage. And when I come off the stage, I'm looking out, and I see him get to the front door, and he stops. And he's got his hand on a door now. And he's standing there for just a second, and then I see him spin around. He comes walking to me, and he comes up to me and says, what is your name? I said, Bill. Bull, good to meet you. I appreciate your ministry. I'm like, what do you mean you appreciate my ministry? You know, I haven't done anything. And he invites me to go to the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. I didn't know what that was. You've heard that part of the story before, but here's where I'm going with this. So I'm like, I tell Beth what's going on, and so he wants me to go, and he was going to meet with me, or talk to me, I should say, the next day, but he had to leave early, so that didn't work out. So I'm like, well, that didn't go the way I thought it was going to go, or the way it seemed to be going. And so I'm beginning to wonder and to doubt a little bit now. So why did that happen? And the guy was going to talk to me, but now he's going to talk to me, and he's off gone somewhere else, and what do I do? And I'm a little puzzled. And then later, when I actually get in touch with somebody in Israel, maybe I'm giving you too many details, but I hope I'm going to kind of tie this up for you so you'll understand why I shared this with you. Beth and I, back in those days, were poor. I mean, we were poor. How many cents did you have to spend at the grocery store that day? $2.86 for 2 weeks. We were poor. So now I got to go to Israel. If I'm going to do this, I got to figure out how to get there. So I call the embassy in Jerusalem. I end up talking to a guy who was one of the main orchestra leaders. And basically his question to me was, well, do you read music? I said, not a lick. You don't read music? Mm-mm. No, I don't. Johan invited you to come? Yeah. I don't think it's going to work out. In fact, I don't think you should come. And I'm like, okay, well, could you just ask him to let me know what he wants me to do? International phone call, we're poor. He says, hold on a minute. Took us 6 months to pay that phone bill. No, I don't know, I'm just playing. But he comes back, the phone, he says, well, Johan says to come. Didn't tell me how or anything like that, just he said to come, click. My point is this. Sometimes God will respond and give us, well, a response that provokes just as many questions as we had before he gave us the response. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? And the whole thing is like, I want it to be one and done, all right? I want to be where I know what's going on, how it's going to happen, but it's never worked out that way. His response to this always provokes another test of my faith. Do I believe that he can finish what he started? And sometimes he's just really hard to figure out. And will you just speak plainly to me? Just point. Can you do that for me, please? Is this making sense to anybody? So the answer may provoke just as many questions as we had before, and particularly when we see his response to their cry to forgive us, heal us of these serpent's bites, verses 8 and 9. Then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. And so it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. So this prompts a lot of questions in my mind, probably you as well. Why did God cause the people to look upon the image of something that had bitten them? The very thing that had bitten them, they're looking upon this image. Why did he use something, the serpent, that is so often associated with evil, and with good reason? Because it was a serpent that had first beguiled the woman to look away and focus on that tree and to partake of that, and that led to Adam's sin. And then couple that with the fact that cursed is anyone who is hung upon a tree. So you got all of these things that provoke these questions. But here's something I want you to consider. Just as the red cow was a reminder of a past sin, that is the golden cow, and not only a reminder of the past sin, but also the red cow represents that mysterious connection to the remedy for our uncleanness, to be made clean. Likewise, the bronze serpent was a reminder of the past sin, this detestable red, why did you bring us out here? All these kinds of things. All those sins of the past, but also it represented the path forward. You go back to Genesis 3, that serpent represented an adversary. But you go ahead, and Messiah identifies himself with that serpent that was raised up in the wilderness. Just as a little footnote sidebar, the word in Hebrew for serpent, nachash, has the same numerical value as the Hebrew word Mashiach. Interesting. The serpent caused Adam to sin because that serpent was allowed to speak to Eve. And by not obeying, not heeding the word of the Lord, Adam exposed himself and Eve to what issued forth from the mouth of this particular serpent. The result was exile and death. That was their consequence. So then, likewise, in disdaining what God had given to them, they loathe this detestable bread, which is representative of the word, of the Messiah himself. By loathing that, disdaining that, they kind of opened themselves up to something else. And that is the bite of the serpent, which implies the word of the serpent. And so I'm about done. I said about. Don't want anybody coming up with me. You had 3 endings. No, I said I'm about done. When we reject God's counsel, we are open to what the serpent has to say. If I had not listened to that voice, what voice would I have listened to from that point forward? So when we reject God's counsel, we open ourselves up to what the serpent has to say. And by the way, sometimes God's counsel comes through other people. And when we receive that counsel and we acknowledge it and attest that it is good, we need to do more than just to give it lip service. It needs to transform our thinking and our actions. And when that does not make sense to us, and many times it doesn't, we need to remember that the problem is on our end, not on the one who's issuing the directions and the instructions. When the people acknowledged their sins and they appealed for mercy, God answered them. He provided the remedy, and that was the serpent on the pole. And he said, when you look at it, you will live. And perhaps that would have seemed a bit foolish. I got bit by a serpent. Why do I want to look at a serpent or the image of a serpent? So maybe it seemed foolish, and even today we read that and like, I don't get it. But if you were one that was bitten by one of those serpents, how foolish would it have been not to look at it? To be stupid and obstinate and just belligerent, I'm not going to look at it, then you die. So it would have been foolish not to look at it. Here's the Hebrew word that is translated pole. It's nun samech, nes. And that word means banner, flag. It's also related to the word for miracle, by the way. It's something that is lifted up. It's something that is raised up to call your attention to it. And in this particular case, when you look at it, then you're going to be healed. Now, more interesting than that, to me anyway, is that the Hebrew word translated as it, referring to the brazen serpent on the pole, that Hebrew word is oto, aleph, tav, vav, which is also the word for him. When you look upon him, you will be healed. By the way, same word is used for the blue cord in the tzitziot. When you look upon it is when you look upon him. So when you look upon him, you will be healed. The him is also who the red cow points us to. The him is also the one that the rock that provided water in the wilderness points us to as well. And so in this bronze serpent upon a pole, God raised up a banner, and he appointed him to be Israel's deliverer and healer and savior, so that all who look upon him would live and be saved. And so this is one of those things that God puts there that on the surface, it really strains and stretches our comprehension. What is he really talking about? Rabbinical commentator said this: does a serpent cause death or life? Rather, when they looked upward and subjected their hearts to the Father in heaven, they were healed. But if not, they died. Emphasis on when they subjected their hearts to the Father in heaven, they were healed. They did what he asked them to do. They were in a desperate situation and they heeded that voice. Another commentator said the brazen serpent was a token of salvation to put them in remembrance of the commandments of your law. For he that turned toward it was not saved because of that which was beheld, but because of you, the Savior of all. So even our Jewish friends understood, or some of them did, that they weren't just looking at a thing, they were looking at a message that God was trying to send them. And your circumstances, if you allow it, it will overwhelm you and will distract you and get you looking at everything except what I'm directing your attention to. In fact, the word that is translated as looked, it comes from a root word that means more than just to look at something. What it really means is to perceive. To look very intently at something and perceive, in this particular case, to look at it and perceive what is God really trying to say to us here. To consider what is it that God's trying to get across to us here. Which is why many times when he presents something to us, even an answer to one petition, we end up with all these other questions. He's provoking us to look at something so intently and to perceive what is it he's trying to teach me through this and by this. And that teaching process never ends. It never ends. We go into the kingdom still learning. We are going to be in the kingdom, and guess what? Still learning. So it is to provoke us. When these questions arise, that doesn't make sense, I can't comprehend that, I don't get it, rather than just stopping and settling, I don't get it, I need to look at it. And I truly need to discern and to perceive, what is it you're trying to teach me through this? What is it I'm supposed to see? To look beyond the physical, to look beyond the temporal, and to see the point and the purpose that God has for it. And so in other words, to perceive it means to gaze upon it not just with these, but with this, right? As this portion began, it addressed the red heifer, which is the epitome of what a chukat is. That is an ordinance that is supposedly and allegedly beyond our comprehension, beyond human understanding. But this Torah portion concludes with Israel encamped right across from Jericho, the gateway to the land of Canaan. And what is my point? We need to continue to listen, to keep our eyes focused on what he's told us to focus on, even and especially when we don't understand and it's hard for us to comprehend. If we'll continue to walk it out, knowing and believing that he's going to bring us to the place that he's promised, that will happen. And so whether we understand God's directive at that particular time or not, the problem is not on his end. The problem is on ours. And if we're finding it to be a problem, there's probably a problem in us he's trying to work out. Daniel-san, wax on, wax off. And so we're reminded just how important it is not to be fixated on the temporal things. Not to be derailed when things don't compute with our logic or reason. As Brad would say, God is smarter than we are. Well, yeah, we say amen, and yes, that's right, but we need to act like it. We need to remember that. We need to follow through on that. And so if he really is smarter than we are, we need to trust his way, and we need to trust his timing. He said, when Sion came out, not allow them to pass through the land, and Sion met them with their army, God said, take them, get them. When Edom did that, he said, go a different way. Why? Because God's smarter than we are. He has a way, he has a purpose, he has a timing, and we need to respect not only his way, but his timing. So when God is hard to comprehend, we are not to lean on our own understanding, but we are to submit ourselves to God into his way, to humble ourselves and keep our focus on the author and the finisher of our faith. And if we do that, he'll lead us to the gateway of our promise. I want you to understand, again, I'm not preaching at you, I'm sharing with you. And what I'm sharing with you is what God is dealing with me about. And so I have to believe that he deals with me about these things. He's probably dealing with others about these things. And maybe, even though the specifics will be different, probably the situation is pretty similar. It's just about testing us and our faith and addressing uncertainty and doubts and disappointments, and sometimes just being downright aggravated with him because he didn't do what we wanted him to do. Let's face it, we get mad with him because he doesn't do what we want him to do. Yeah, all right, okay, all right. I'm the only one. We get mad with him when he doesn't do what we want him to do, when we want him to do it, how we want him to do it. I'm learning to try to overcome that. I'm trying to learn anyway.